Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. This story might not be one of a kind. I'm sure it's played out somewhere across the country with all sorts of different vehicles. But given the era of the mid-60s and our country being at war, it carries a special weight. Either way, let's get started, and thanks for being here. The dust in the garage of the Davis household didn't settle. It hovered, suspended in the shafts of Oklahoma sunlight that pierced through the high cracked windows. In the center of the bay sat the 1966 Chevelle Supersport, its marina blue paint glowing like a polished jewel against the concrete. It was more than a car. To young Jimmy Davis, it was the prize he'd bought with combat pay and the restless energy of a 90-day convalescent leave. He'd come home from his first tour with a jagged purple scar on his shoulder and a thirst for the open road that only a 396 cubic inch V8 could quench. For 3 months, that car was the soundtrack of the county. The roar of the dual exhausts echoed off the canyon walls and rattled the windows of the local diner. He took it everywhere, to the lake, to the gravel pits, and down the long, straight stretches of highway where he could let the needle climb until the world outside became a blur. But as the 90 days dwindled, Jimmy spent more time in the garage than on the road, polishing the chrome until it shone like a mirror. When the day came to ship back out, he didn't sell it. He didn't even cover it. He just parked it, kissed his mother, and told his father to keep the seals moist. The humidity in the central highlands of Vietnam was a thick, physical weight, but Jimmy Davis moved through it like a man who was already halfway home. To the rest of the unit, the mud was just mud, but to Jimmy, every rain-slicked trail was just a reminder of how much better the traction would be on the asphalt back in Oklahoma. He didn't just talk about the Chevelle, he preached it. During the long, hushed stretches of night watch, or while they were cleaning their rifles in the flickering light of a bunker, Jimmy would lean back and close his eyes. "Marina blue," he'd whisper, the words sounding like a prayer. It isn't just blue, man. It's like the sky right before a storm hits the plains. And the chrome? You could shave in the reflection of the bumper. His squad leader, a weary sergeant from Chicago who had seen too much of the jungle, would usually just grunt. "Davis, if I hear about that 396 cubic inch engine one more time, I'm going to personally sabotage your intake manifold." Jimmy would just grin, white teeth flashing against a face smeared with green and black camo paint. "Sarge, you don't understand. You don't just drive a Supersport. You pilot it. When you hit fourth gear, the whole front end lifts just a hair, like it's trying to take off. My old man says it sounds like a thunderstorm in a tin can." He had a Polaroid of it tucked inside his helmet liner, wrapped in a piece of plastic to keep the sweat off. It showed him standing next to the driver's side door, leaning casually against the fender with a wrench in his hand and a look of pure, unadulterated pride. "I got plans for her when I get back," Jimmy told a new replacement one evening while they shared a lukewarm sea ration. "I'm gonna bore out the cylinders, maybe put a different cam in it. But for now, she's just sitting there in the dark, waiting. I told my dad to run the engine once a week so the gaskets don't dry out. Can't have a leak in a masterpiece." The guys in his unit started calling him Chevelle more often than Jimmy. It became a bit of a morale booster, a piece of the world that felt real and tangible. When the mail was slow or the patrols were grueling, someone would inevitably pipe up, "Hey Davis, tell us about the interior again. Is it the bucket seats or the bench?" "Buckets," Jimmy would say, his voice losing its exhaustion for a moment. "Black vinyl. Smells like a mix of new plastic and high-octane gas. When you sit in it, you feel like you're the king of the interstate." For those 5 months, that car wasn't just a machine. It was Jimmy's promise to himself. It was the reason he kept his boots dry and his head down. He talked about it until the day he went out on his final patrol, telling the radio operator that as soon as they got back to base, he was going to write home and remind his mom and dad he would be coming home soon. The fog was a thick, milky soup that clung to the elephant grass, muffling the sound of boots and the metallic clink of gear. Jimmy Davis was walking point. He had his helmet tilted back, the Polaroid of the Marina blue Chevelle tucked against his temple like a lucky charm. He'd been unusually quiet that morning, only whispering to his RTO, a skinny kid from Ohio named Pearson, that he could almost smell the rain back in Oklahoma. The ambush didn't start with a shout. It started with a click. A tripwire, thin as a spider's silk, snapped. Before the first grenade could even clear the brush, Jimmy was moving. He didn't dive for cover. He dove toward Pearson and the sergeant, who were pinned in the kill zone of a concealed machine gun nest. "Get back! Tree line now!" Jimmy's voice cracked through the jungle like a whip. He laid down a frantic, rhythmic bass of fire, his M16 barking as he stood his ground. He was a human shield, drawing every bit of attention toward himself so the rest of the squad could scramble into the safety of the heavy timber. Pearson had tripped, his radio snagged on a root, making him a sitting duck. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He lunged into the open, grabbed Pearson by the load-bearing vest, and literally threw the younger man toward a ravine. As he did, the jungle erupted. Jimmy took the hits, but he didn't drop. Not yet. He stayed upright just long enough to hurl his last 2 grenades, silencing the nest that had his friends pinned down. Because of those 10 seconds of pure, unadulterated grit, 6 men who should have died that morning, including young Pearson, were able to crawl, bleed, and fight their way to the extraction choppers. Through the suffocating smoke, the sergeant reached out, his fingers just inches from the man he couldn't save. "Hold on, Jimmy! Just stay there!" he roared against the heavy fire. Jimmy didn't flinch. He turned his gaze upward, his expression settling into a haunting, distant peace. With a shallow, rattling breath and a smile that defied the war around them, he whispered, "I'm going for a drive, Sarge." Before the sergeant could reply, Jimmy was gone. They came back for the bodies an hour later. As they moved Jimmy, his helmet fell, shaking loose a blood-streaked photo. The sergeant stared at it, tears blurring his vision as he tried to clean the image against his shirt. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words sounding hollow against the roar of the war. "I'm so sorry, kid." Private Jones grabbed his shoulder. "Sarge, we gotta go now." "I'm so sorry, Jimmy." "Sarge," Jones urged, "we're out of time." With a trembling hand, the sergeant drew the poncho over Jimmy's face, finally letting the drive begin. The unit made it out. They went home to their wives, their mothers, and their own quiet lives in Ohio, Chicago, and New York. They carried the weight of Jimmy's sacrifice in their hearts, but none of them knew about the secret he'd left back in the garage in Oklahoma. They only knew that a kid who loved a blue car had given them the one thing he wouldn't get to have: a tomorrow. The knock at the door didn't sound like a normal visitor. It was heavy, rhythmic, and carried the weight of the government. When Thomas Davis opened the door, the Oklahoma wind whipped a bit of dust into the entryway, but the 2 men standing there in their dress blues didn't flinch. The senior officer, "I am Major Ornella, representing the United States Marine Corps," with graying temples and a chest full of ribbons, removed his cover and stepped inside. He looked at Thomas, then at Jimmy's mother, who had frozen near the kitchen table, her hands still dusted with flour. The officer cleared his throat, his voice steady but thick with a gravity that made the room feel smaller. "Mr. and Mrs. Davis," he began, his eyes meeting theirs with a painful honesty. "I am here on behalf of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, to express our deepest regrets. Your son, Corporal James Davis, was lost in action 4 days ago in the Central Highlands." He took a slow breath, glancing at the photo of Jimmy on the mantel, the one of him grinning next to that marina blue Chevelle. "I want you to know," the officer continued, "that Jimmy didn't just serve, he led. That morning, his unit was caught in a heavy ambush. Your son was at the point. Instead of seeking cover for himself, he put his own life on the line to pull his RTO, a young man named Pearson, and his squad leader out of the line of fire. He stayed in the open, holding back the enemy long enough for 6 of his brothers to reach safety." The officer's voice softened then, losing some of its military rigidity. "Those 6 men are alive today because of Jimmy. They've already sent word back. They want you to know he was the best of them. He wasn't just a soldier to them, he was the heart of that squad. We are profoundly sorry for your loss. A man like Jimmy, you don't just replace a soul like that. He was a hero in the truest sense of the word." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic-wrapped bundle. "This was found in his helmet. We thought you should have it back immediately." It was the Polaroid of the car. Jimmy's mother grabbed the sides of her dress, looking down, and tears falling to her lap. Thomas took the photo, his thumb brushing over the image of his son and the chrome bumper of the '66 Supersport. The officer stood at attention one last time, both officers reached out, shake hands with the parents of a man who had traded his own tomorrow for the lives of 6 others. At the funeral, when they were talking and praising their son for the love of his brother in arms, the men raised their rifles every time they heard the crack of the rifles. Both parents flinched. The second set, everyone flinched. Third set, everyone crying. With a blur of folded flags, the sharp scent of lilies, and the heavy silence of a town that had lost one of its brightest lights. When the last of the mourners finally left the house and the casseroles were tucked away in the fridge, Thomas Davis found himself standing by the back door. The evening air was cooling, the Oklahoma sky turning a bruised purple. He walked across the yard to the detached garage. The door creaked on its hinges, a lonely sound that echoed in the quiet evening. Inside, the 1966 Chevelle Supersport sat like a ghost. In the dim light, the marina blue paint looked darker, almost like the depths of the ocean. The dust had begun to settle on the hood, a thin veil that Thomas hated to see. He walked around the car slowly, his fingers trailing along the body line, the sharp, aggressive curve of the rear fender that Jimmy loved so much. He remembered the day Jimmy brought it home. The kid had been grinning so hard his face looked like it was going to split. "She's a beast, Pop," he'd said. "Just wait till you hear the cam hit." Thomas stopped at the driver's side door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the chrome handle. It felt like trespassing on a dream that hadn't finished yet. Finally, he clicked the handle, and the door swung open with that familiar, heavy mechanical thud. The smell hit him instantly. It was Jimmy. It was a mix of Old Spice, cheap peppermint gum, and the faint, oily perfume of high-performance machinery. It was the smell of a 19-year-old's life, preserved in a vacuum of vinyl and steel. Thomas sank into the driver's seat. He was taller than Jimmy, and his knees hit the steering column. He reached down to the lever to slide the bucket seat back. He knew his hand had touched this last hope to feel something. As if his son's very ghost were fading from the seat, Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He could feel Jimmy here. He could feel where Jimmy's hands had once rested. When he finally looked up, his wife was standing there, staring through the glass. She wasn't looking for the car or for Jimmy. She was looking at Thomas. But the look of desperate hope on her face, the way she searched his eyes for a son who wasn't coming back, it was too much. I couldn't take it. She saw the truth in my expression, turned, and walked away, her shoulders shaking with every sob. Thomas moved with a grim, mechanical focus. He didn't want to see the way the light caught the marina blue paint anymore. It hurt too much to look at a reflection that didn't include his son. He spent the entire afternoon in the garage. He worked in a silence broken only by the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the floor jack and the heavy thud of the cinder blocks as he set them under the frame. One by one, the tires left the concrete, the suspension decompressing as the weight was lifted. He wanted to save the rubber, to save the seals, to save everything exactly as Jimmy had left it, frozen in 1967. Then came the covers. He didn't just use one. He started with soft flannel sheets to protect the finish, then heavy wool blankets, and finally thick industrial tarps. 10 layers in total, tucked tightly around the bumpers and wheel wells until the Chevelle no longer looked like a car. It looked like a tomb, a great, hulking shape in the center of the dark garage. When he finally walked back into the kitchen, his hands were covered in a fine layer of dust, and his back ached, but his eyes were hollow. He sat down across from his wife, his voice barely a whisper. "It's up on blocks," Thomas said, staring at his calloused palms. "Double covered, 10 layers deep. I can't look at it, Martha. I can't look at that seat and know he's not coming back to sit in it." Martha didn't cry. She just reached across the table and took his hand, a small, sad smile touching her lips. She knew that garage was the only place Thomas could still feel the ghost of their boy, even if he had to bury the car to handle the grief. "I know, honey," she said softly. "No one is to ever touch that car. At least not right now. It's his. We'll just let it sleep." The year was 1967. Outside, the world was moving fast. Music was changing, the war was dragging on, and the neighbors were trading in their steel bumpers for plastic. But inside that Oklahoma garage, time stopped. Years later, Thomas stepped back into the garage to grab some tools for a broken sink. The air inside was stifling, thick enough to cook an egg, and it felt like the heat was erasing the last traces of his son. That was the day he decided to change things. He installed a dedicated climate system, keeping the room at a constant, crisp 65 degrees. Once the air was perfect, he sealed every window and reinforced the door. He didn't just want it cool, he wanted it untouchable. Not even a mouse would find its way into Jimmy's space now. The year was 2026, and the humid Oklahoma air felt heavy with the scent of mown grass and forgotten things. The Davis estate sat at the end of the gravel drive, a modest house that had once been filled with the smell of Sunday pot roast and the sound of a boy's laughter. Now it was filled with cardboard boxes and the cold efficiency of a for sale sign. Jimmy's younger siblings, Sarah and David, stood on the back porch. Their father had passed a few years back, holding on to the house until his heart simply grew too tired. Their mother had followed him just last year, leaving behind a lifetime of neatly folded linens and a garage that had remained padlocked since the height of the LBJ administration. "I can't even look at it, David," Sarah said, twisting her car keys in her hand. "Every time I think about that garage, I just see Dad's face the day they came to the door. It's like the war never actually ended for this family. It just moved into that shed and stayed there." David nodded, his eyes fixed on the weathered wood of the garage door. "I know. It was a shrine he wouldn't let us touch. But the realtor says the buyers want the lot cleared. We have the title from the lockbox, and it's time. We aren't car people, and honestly, I don't want a reminder of a brother I barely got to know in a war that broke our parents. They didn't want the car. To them, it wasn't a classic or a collector's item. It was a heavy blue weight that had anchored their father to a grief he could never quite shake. It was a bad memory wrapped in steel. They had put out a quiet word in the local papers and vintage forums. 1966, Chevelle SS, one owner, estate sale, serious inquiries only. They didn't want a flipper or someone who would tear it apart for parts. Despite their own lack of interest, they felt a lingering, silent obligation to find someone who would understand that this wasn't just a machine. It was a piece of a man who never got to grow old. When the heavy padlock finally snapped open under the pressure of the bolt cutters, the door groaned on rusted rollers. The air that puffed out was stale, smelling of 1967. There it was. A massive, humped shape in the center of the floor, shrouded in 10 thick layers of rot-resistant tarps and moth-eaten wool blankets. The tires were long gone, the car sitting high and skeletal on the cinder blocks Thomas had placed there nearly 60 years ago. "There she is," David whispered, though he didn't move closer. "The ghost of the family." "Let's just find the buyer, Dave," Sarah said, stepping back into the sunlight. "The right one. Someone who can take the weight of it off our shoulders." The man who pulled into the driveway wasn't a collector with a flatbed trailer or a dealer looking for a quick flip. He was older, with a military gait and a faded 1st Marine Division ball cap pulled low over his eyes. His name was Harry, and he'd driven 3 states over because he'd heard a rumor about a time capsule Chevelle in a small Oklahoma town. David met him at the garage door. The air inside was still, thick with the scent of 60 years of trapped history. "My father put those covers on in 67, David said, his voice echoing in the rafters. "He never took them off, not once. He couldn't bear the color of it." Harry nodded slowly, surprised by the dedicated climate system, his eyes fixed on the massive, shrouded shape. He didn't rush. He walked around the car once, his boots crunching on the dry floor, before he reached for the corner of the tarp. "Mind if I—" "Go ahead," Sarah said from the doorway, her arms crossed. "We just want it to go to someone who knows what it is." Harry began to peel back the layers. The first 2 were heavy, brittle plastic tarps that cracked like parchment. Underneath were 3 layers of thick, moth-eaten wool blankets, olive drab, likely surplus from the same era. Then came 2 more layers of old canvas, stained with the oil of a generation past. Finally, the last 3 layers, soft, white flannel sheets that Thomas had tucked in with a precision that bordered on the holy. As the last sheet slid off the hood, the marina blue paint emerged. It wasn't dull. Protected from the sun and the wind for nearly 6 decades, the pigment was deep, electric, and terrifyingly beautiful. The chrome of the Supersport emblem caught a stray beam of light and threw a jagged reflection against the dusty wall. Harry stopped. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he parked his truck. He reached out a hand, hesitating, before resting a palm on the cool, smooth metal of the front fender. "My God," he whispered. "It's like he just stepped out of it yesterday." He stepped to the driver's side, his breath hitching as he peered through the glass. The black vinyl bucket seats were flawless, untouched by time. The Hurst shifter stood tall, poised, and ready for a hand that would never return. On the dashboard, a thin shroud of dust lay over the gauges, the very dials that once told a 19-year-old boy he was flying. Then Harry saw it. He froze, doing a double take that made his heart skip. He looked at the kids, his voice a low rasp. When was the last time this car moved? They traded a look, their voices overlapping in a haunting unison. 1966. Harry's breath left him. He looked back at the odometer, 3,027 miles. He pushed his ball cap back, his head spinning. This wasn't just a vintage car, it was a survivor, frozen in the very moment the world stopped turning for Jimmy. "He didn't just save a car," Harry said, looking back at the siblings. "Your father saved a moment. This isn't a machine, kids. This is a ghost that's been waiting to scream." David and Sarah looked at each other. For the first time, the bad memory felt like something else, something powerful. "I'll take her," Harry said, his voice cracking just a hair. "I'll take her, and I won't change a thing. I just want to hear that engine breathe again." He didn't know about the note yet. He didn't know that tucked into the deep, dark crease of that driver's seat was a message from a boy who had traded his life for his brother's. He just knew that as he looked at the car, he felt a strange, sudden urge to stand at attention. Harry didn't use a trailer with a winch. He hired a specialized transport. He watched with a silent, reverent intensity as the marina blue Chevelle was lowered onto the floor of his own shop 300 miles away. The shop was quiet, the air smelling of fresh wax and floor sealant. Harry didn't start with the engine. He didn't check the spark plugs or the fuel lines. He started with the interior. He felt that to understand the car, he had to sit where the boy had sat. He opened the driver's side door. The hinges gave a dry, metallic protest, the first time they had swung wide in nearly 60 years. Harry pulled a small, high-powered LED flashlight from his pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the shadows of the cabin, dancing over the tachometer and the pristine black vinyl of the bucket seats. "All right, Jimmy," Harry whispered to the empty air. "Let's see what you left behind." He began by vacuuming the floorboards with a soft bristled attachment, careful not to scuff the original carpet. He wiped down the dashboard, watching the dust vanish to reveal the sparkling chrome trim. Then, he reached down to the adjustment lever under the driver's seat. He needed to slide it forward to get a better angle on the rear floorboards. As the seat groaned back on its tracks, something caught. It wasn't a mechanical catch. It was the sound of stiff, aging paper being pinched. Harry reached into the dark gap between the seat cushion and the center console. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic first, a small, tarnished brass Zippo lighter, and then, tucked deeper still, a thick yellowed envelope. He pulled it out. The grease from a 19-year-old's hands had turned into dark, permanent stains on the corners. His heart skipped a beat as he read the blocky, hurried handwriting, "To whoever finds this first." Harry sat on the edge of the door frame, his legs dangling out, and carefully broke the seal. Inside was the note Thomas had never found, but there was a second, smaller piece of paper tucked behind it, a folded-up map of a specific coordinate in the Highlands and a phone number for a Pearson in Ohio. He read the letter. Jimmy's voice seemed to jump off the page, bypassing the decades. "Pop, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I didn't make it back to do the driving myself. But there's something you gotta do for me. There's a kid in my unit, Pearson. He's the RTO. He's from a little town outside of Cincinnati. I told him every single day in the mud about this car. I promised him that when we got back to the world, I was gonna pick him up and give him the ride of his life. I told him he'd finally get to feel what 400 horsepower feels like on a flat stretch of road. He saved my skin more than once before that morning, Pop. He's my brother. If I don't make it, please, find him. Give him that ride. Tell him the Chevelle is waiting for him. Don't let the promise die with me. Harry looked at the phone number. It was an old-style exchange, likely disconnected for 40 years. He looked at the car, the blue paint shimmering under his shop lights. The secret wasn't about money or parts. It was an unfulfilled debt of brotherhood. Harry picked up his cell phone. He had resources Jimmy never dreamed of. He knew how to find people. He looked at the name Pearson and then back at the letter. "Well, Jimmy," Harry said, his voice thick. "I think it's time we went to Ohio." The search for Pearson wasn't as simple as a White Pages lookup. In 2026, the digital trail of a veteran from 1967 was buried under decades of data. Harry spent 3 nights at his workbench, the marina blue Chevelle looming behind him like a silent sentinel. He tracked the name through VA archives and old VFW newsletters. He found a Arthur Artie Pearson in a small township outside Cincinnati. The records showed a man who had come home, worked 40 years at a machine tool plant, and retired to a quiet life. Harry didn't call. A man doesn't phone in a 60-year-old promise. He prepped the car. He spent 2 weeks meticulously bringing the 396 back to life. He replaced the dry-rotted hoses, drained the varnished fuel, and rebuilt the carburetor with surgical precision. When he finally turned the key, the garage didn't just fill with noise. It shook with the roar of a ghost waking up. The dual exhausts barked a fierce, rhythmic greeting to the 21st century. It started with a name on a screen and ended with a phone call that changed everything. Linda found Artie's daughter, Tina, and explained why they were calling. There was a long silence on the other end. "My father. He's older now. He stays home mostly," Tina whispered. "But if this is about Jimmy, you name the day. I'll make sure he's there. I think he needs to tell this story as much as you need to hear it." The drive to Ohio was done in an enclosed hauler, but 2 miles from the address, Harry pulled over. He lowered the ramp and backed the Chevelle out onto the asphalt. The sun hit the marina blue paint, and for the first time since 1967, the car was breathing open air. He drove slowly through the quiet residential streets. The rumble of the V8 brought neighbors to their porches. The car looked like a shimmering blue tear in the fabric of time. He turned onto a modest cul-de-sac and saw an elderly man sitting in a lawn chair, a cane resting against his knee, staring at the horizon. Harry pulled the Chevelle right up to the curb, the chrome bumper gleaming. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was heavy. The old man, Artie Pearson, stood up slowly. His eyes weren't on Harry. They were locked on the front fender. He began to tremble, his hand reaching out as if to touch a mirage. "Jimmy?" the old man whispered, his voice cracking. Is that his car?" Harry stepped out, the yellowed envelope in his hand. He walked up the driveway, meeting the eyes of the man Jimmy had died to save. "My name is Harry," he said softly. "I bought this car from the Davis estate. I found something tucked in the seat that belongs to you. It took 60 years to get here. To my understanding, Jimmy Davis never broke a promise." He handed Pearson the note. The old veteran's fingers shook so hard the paper rattled. As he read Jimmy's words, the part about the ride, the part about being brothers in the mud, Pearson sank back into his chair and wept. "He told me," Pearson sobbed, clutching the note to his chest. "Every night in the Highlands, he told me he was going to pick me up in a blue streak of lightning. I thought it was just a dream we used to keep from quitting." Harry reached down and offered his hand. "The tank is full, Artie, and I think Jimmy's been waiting long enough. You want to see what 400 horsepower feels like?" Pearson looked at the car, then at the sky, a smile breaking through the tears. He tossed his cane aside. "I've been waiting since the morning he threw me into that ravine. Let's go for a drive." The Chevelle didn't just start, it roared back to life, a sleeping giant finally awakened. As it tore down the open Ohio highway, the car barked into second gear, pulling a jagged smile from Artie's face. But when the tires chirped in third, a lone, hot tear broke free, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. As the needle climbed past 60, the air in the cabin changed. It was like the car was breathing, like the ghost of Jimmy Davis wasn't in a silent grave in Oklahoma anymore. He was right there in the slipstream, screaming down the asphalt in fourth gear, finally, mercifully, home. The drive through the Ohio countryside wasn't fast at first. Harry kept the Chevelle at a steady hum, letting the old machine stretch its legs after 60 years of slumber. Beside him, Artie Pearson ran his weathered hand over the black vinyl of the dashboard, his eyes wet with a memory that was no longer gray and jagged, but vibrant and blue. "He used to tell me," Artie said, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the 396, "that the chrome on this car was so bright you could see the future in it. I used to laugh at him. We were sitting in a hole covered in red mud, and he's talking about marina blue. I thought he was crazy, Harry. I thought he was just making it up to keep from screaming." Artie looked out the window as a field of corn blurred past. "But that morning, the morning we got hit, Jimmy didn't even blink. He threw me like I was a sack of grain. I remember looking back from the ravine, and the last thing I saw wasn't a soldier. It was a kid who looked like he was already somewhere else. He had this look on his face, not fear, just focus, like he was shifting into fourth gear." Harry pulled the car onto a long, straight stretch of blacktop and glanced at Artie. "He told his folks he was going for a drive at the end. I think he was already in this seat." Tina and Linda walk over to the boys. When they finally pulled back into Artie's driveway, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the hood. Harry hopped out and walked to the rear of the car. He'd brought the original keys, the ones Thomas Davis had kept in a velvet box until the day he died. "There was one more thing in the note," Harry said, fitting the key into the trunk lock. "Jimmy mentioned a coffee can." The trunk lid popped with a hollow metallic clank. Inside, the spare tire was an original bias ply, the rubber cracked with age, but the rim still painted that deep factory black. Harry leaned in and heaved the tire upward. Tucked into the well, resting against the cold steel of the floor pan, was an old rusted Folgers coffee can. The plastic lid was brittle, snapping into pieces the moment Harry touched it. Artie leaned over the fender, his breath catching. Tina and Linda looking in surprise. Inside the can wasn't just money. There was a stack of silver certificates and old $20 bills, crisp and smelling of the 1960s, enough to keep a gas tank full for a lifetime of Sunday drives. But sitting on top of the cash was a small, olive-drab matchbook from a bar in Saigon and a hand-carved wooden bird. "He made that for me," Artie whispered, reaching into the can. He picked up the bird, his thumb tracing the rough-hewn wings. "I told him I missed the Cardinals back in Ohio. He carved this with a bayonet while we were waiting for a supply drop. He told me he'd give it to me when we got home." Also in the can was a second Polaroid. It wasn't of the car. It was a photo of the unit. Jimmy, Artie, the sergeant, and the rest of the squad, grinning and muddy, standing in front of a sandbagged bunker. On the back, in Jimmy's blocky print, it simply said, "The real Supersports. See you at the finish line, Pearson." The two men stood in the quiet Ohio evening, the cooling engine of the Chevelle ticking like a heartbeat. The debt was paid. The promise was kept. And for the first time since 1967, the weight of the war felt just a little bit lighter, carried away by the roar of a Marina Blue car and a 396 engine and the wind of an open road. The 1966 Chevelle didn't go back into a dark garage. Harry and Artie made sure of that. After that first afternoon in Ohio, the car became a bridge between two worlds. Harry didn't restore it in the way collectors do. He didn't scrub away the faint grease stain on the driver's seat or polish out the tiny scratch on the dash where Jimmy's ring had once tapped along to the radio. He kept it exactly as it was, a survivor. A few weeks later, Sarah and David Davis received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph of Artie Pearson leaning against the Marina Blue fender with a smile that took 40 years off his face. The letter was written in Artie's shaky but determined hand. "Your brother didn't just buy a car. He bought a way home for all of us. I spent 60 years wondering why I was the one who got to see the sunset, and your brother's note gave me the answer. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who kept his eyes on the horizon. Thank you for letting me have my ride." For the siblings, the bad memory finally dissolved. The car wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a legacy. They kept that photo on the mantle, right next to the one of Jimmy in his dress blues. Harry and Artie spent the next 3 summers taking the Chevelle to veterans' reunions and local shows. They didn't put it on a pedestal. They let kids sit in the seats and they let old men with Vietnam veteran hats run their hands over the paint. The car stayed with Harry, but it was never truly his. It remained a rolling testament to a promise made in the mud and kept across the decades. On quiet nights when the engine was cooling in the shop, you could almost hear the faint echo of a 19-year-old's laugh in the ticking of the metal, a boy who finally got to see his car fly. The transition from the roar of the Chevelle to the humid silence of the Highlands was a heavy one. After the car shows, where the marina blue paint had acted as a beacon for aging men in Vietnam veteran caps to share their own buried stories, Harry and Artie realized the map Jimmy left behind wasn't a suggestion, it was a final order. With the help of a veterans advocacy group, they secured the necessary permits to travel into the heart of the Central Highlands. The trek was grueling for Artie. He refused a wheelchair, leaning on his cane and Harry's shoulder as they navigated the thick red clay trails. The jungle had reclaimed the scars of the 1960s. Where fire bases once stood, there was now only towering teak and bamboo. "He said it was near a lightning-scarred tree," Artie whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "He told me he'd marked it so he could find it when he came back for me. He never thought he wouldn't be the one digging it up." After hours of searching, the GPS coordinates finally chirped. There, standing like a skeletal sentinel against a backdrop of emerald green, was the tree. Its trunk was twisted, a black, jagged streak running from the canopy to the roots, the mark of a strike that had happened decades ago. Harry handled the shovel. 2 feet down, the blade struck something hollow and metallic. The sound, a sharp clink, made Artie gasp. It was the sound of a secret finally being told. They pulled the ammunition can from the earth. It was caked in 60 years of soil, but the rubber seal had held. When they pried it open, the interior was pristine. When Harry and Artie, guided by Jimmy's map, finally located and excavated the ammunition can from the base of the lightning-scarred teak tree, they were prepared to find relics of Jimmy's unlived life, blueprints, perhaps a final letter to his parents. Instead, when Harry pried open the rusted, rubber-sealed lid, the air that escaped did not smell of 1960s gasoline and Oklahoma dust. It smelled of stale rice, damp paper, and the sharp, ferrous scent of dried blood. Tucked tightly inside the waterproof container were not Jimmy's belongings, but a dense stack of small, varied notebooks, bound with twine and wrapped in fading plastic. These were personal diaries and letters taken from deceased North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC soldiers. It became clear to Artie, as he looked at the foreign script, that Jimmy hadn't buried a cache for himself. He had created a sanctuary for the memories of his enemies. In the brutal body count reality of the war, these personal items were often discarded or treated as trophies. Jimmy, the kid who was too busy dreaming of chrome to hate, couldn't bear to let these voices vanish. He had gathered them from battlefields across the Highlands, carefully sealing them away at this coordinate. Perhaps he intended to return and find a way to get them back to Hanoi one day. Perhaps it was his private way of acknowledging that the men he was fighting also had families, dreams, and a home they were missing. For Harry and Artie, the mission instantly shifted. The priority was no longer the Chevelle, it was about honoring the profound humanity of Jimmy's final act. They spent the next year working with veterans' reconciliation groups, international archives, and translators. Slowly, names were matched to missing personnel rosters. They found the family of Nguyen Van Duc, a 19-year-old poet from Hanoi, whose notebook contained pressed jungle flowers and verses dedicated to a girlfriend who never married. They returned a stained letter to the daughter of Le Thi Bin, a female VC medic, who had written to her child promising she would be home for the Tet holiday. The return of these diaries provided undeniable closure to families who had spent decades wondering where their loved ones had fallen. It transformed Jimmy's legacy from that of simply a brave soldier and a car enthusiast into a symbol of ultimate reconciliation. By marking those coordinates on a folded-up map, Jimmy Davis hadn't just left a message for Artie, he had left a path for 2 nations to begin binding their wounds. The village of Hoa Binh sat nestled in a valley of vibrant green, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and jasmine. Harry and Artie didn't come in a military transport. They arrived in a small, dusty van, carrying a single wooden box. They were met at the edge of a family compound by an elderly woman named Ba Lin. She stood small and straight, her white hair pulled back, her eyes sharp yet clouded by 8 decades of waiting. Behind her stood 3 generations of her family, all silent, all watching the 2 tall Americans. Artie, leaning heavily on his cane, stepped forward first. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a mother who had spent 60 years staring at the same horizon he had. Through a young translator, Harry opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of silk, was a small, mud-stained diary with a frayed red star on the cover. "This belonged to your brother, Nguyen Van Min," Harry said softly. "It was found in the Highlands, protected in a steel box by a young American Marine named Jimmy Davis. He didn't want these words to be lost to the mud." As the translator spoke, Ba Lin's hands began to shake. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the weathered paper before finally touching it. The moment her skin met the diary, a sob broke from her. Not a loud cry, but a soft, rhythmic keening that seemed to pull the very air from the valley. She opened the first page. There, in a neat, cramped hand, was a poem Min had written about the moon over their village. He had written it just 3 days before he fell. Artie watched her, tears tracking through the deep lines of his own face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird Jimmy had carved for him, the one from the coffee can. He held it out to the woman's grandson, a boy about the same age Jimmy had been in 1967. "He was a good man," Artie whispered, looking at the grandmother. "The boy who saved this, he wanted you to have his voice back." Ba Lin looked up from the diary, her eyes meeting Artie's. In that look, the war finally died. There was no North or South, no Marine or Viet Cong. There were only 2 survivors of a terrible storm, standing in the sunlight. She took Artie's hand in hers, one rough from the fields of Vietnam, the other scarred from the factories of Ohio, and pressed it to her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered in English, the words jagged but clear. As Harry and Artie walked back to the van, they looked toward the mountains. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a marina blue Chevelle was waiting in a quiet shop, its chrome catching the light. But here, in a small village garden, a family was finally reading the words of a son who had been gone for 60 years. Jimmy Davis had promised a ride to his brother, but he had given a miracle to his enemy. The finish line wasn't a stretch of highway in Oklahoma. It was right here, in the quiet closing of a wooden box. The news arrived on a Tuesday, cutting through the quiet of the morning. Tina's voice was small over the phone when she called Harry's wife, but the weight of her words was immense. Harry was already moving toward his favorite armchair when his wife walked in, her face pale. As soon as she said the words, that Artie had passed away peacefully in his sleep, Harry just sat down. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just stared at his hands, the same hands that had helped Artie into the passenger seat of that blue Chevelle so many times. 4 weeks later, the air had turned sharp with the coming of winter. Linda and Tina stood by the driveway, wrapped in heavy coats, watching in silence as Harry climbed into the driver's seat. On that crisp autumn morning, the sky was a hard, brilliant blue that matched the car perfectly. Harry backed the Chevelle out and pointed the nose toward that long, straight stretch of Oklahoma highway where 60 years ago, Jimmy Davis used to let the needle climb. The interior of the car felt different now, hollower, yet heavy with the presence of 2 ghosts. Harry reached into the glove box and pulled out the small satchel of Artie's ashes. He set it on the center console. Tina is right where Artie always sat, the moment he turned onto the main road. He didn't hold back. He pinned the throttle, seating in the back. Linda was holding on and looking out the windshield, and the 396 roared into a defiant, beautiful song that echoed across the open plains. The speedometer swept upward, the wind rushing through the open windows until it felt like the car was barely touching the ground. The wind was a roar now, a physical thing that filled the cabin of the Chevelle, smelling of sun-baked asphalt and high-octane dreams. Harry felt the vibration of the 396 through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that seemed to pulse in time with his own. He gripped the Hurst shifter, his knuckles white, and slammed it into 4th gear. The engine didn't just scream. It sang a defiant, beautiful anthem to the open Oklahoma plains. Harry looked over at Tina, her hair whipping wildly in the gale, her eyes bright with a grief that had finally found its purpose. He nodded once. his voice thick but steady. "Go ahead, Tina," he said. "Send him home." With a hand that didn't tremble, Tina reached out into the rushing air. She opened the small satchel, and the gray mist of Artie's ashes was caught instantly by the slipstream. It vanished into the shimmering wake of the Marina Blue Streak, scattering over the red dirt Jimmy had once walked, and onto the endless open road that Artie had finally claimed as his own. In the back seat, Linda reached forward, her fingers digging into Harry's shoulder, anchoring them all to the moment. Tears streamed down Harry's face, unhidden and hot, blurring the horizon he had spent so long chasing. "This is good, Harry," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "This is exactly how it was supposed to end." Tina turned back from the window, her face a beautiful, breaking map of sorrow and joy. She looked at Linda, crying and smiling at the same time, her chest heaving with the first easy breath she'd taken in weeks. "Yes," Tina choked out, clutching the empty satchel to her heart. "Yes, it is." Looking at both of them, she moved her lips. "Thank you." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between the usual bills and flyers, but the handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Tina's elegant, slightly trembling script. Harry sat at the kitchen table, the sun catching the chrome of a small model Chevelle sitting on the windowsill as Linda leaned over his shoulder to read.
Dearest Harry and Linda, I've picked up this pen a dozen times today, trying to find the right words to say what's in my heart. Thank you. Feels so small, like a drop of water in the ocean. But I need you to know what this last year has meant. For the longest time, most of my life really, my father was a man without a purpose. He was a ghost in his own house, wandering through his days like he was still lost in that jungle, looking for a way out that didn't exist. He carried a silence so heavy it felt like it might break him. And then you showed up. You brought that blue car into our driveway, and it was like you brought the light back with it. That story, that map, and that trip to Vietnam. Harry, when he came home, he was a different man. The shadows in his eyes had finally started to lift. Because of you, he finally found the strength to deal with the things he had been burying deep inside for 60 years. For the first time in my life, we actually talked, really talked. He sat me down and told me about his time in Vietnam, the fear, the heat, and the boy named Jimmy who saved his soul before he ever even knew it. It's been a lot to deal with, and the house feels so quiet now that he's gone. But it's a peaceful quiet. He didn't die a lost man. He died a man who had finally made it home. Thank you for giving my father his life back before he had to leave us. Thank you for keeping the promise. With all my love, Tina.
Harry folded the letter carefully, his eyes blurring as he looked out toward the garage. He could almost hear the low, distant rumble of a 396 engine, and for a moment he could see them. Two young men in a Marina Blue Streak, finally driving fast into the sunset, with no more maps left to follow. Thank you for watching and listening. There is more stories to come, and if you like this content, please subscribe and a thumbs up. Please leave a comment of where you are from.